Alright, so today we've got the T120 and the T100. This one's 1200 cc's, this one's 900 cc's. This one's a bit more expensive, this is a bit more affordable. So today we're going to look at all the details, take them both for a little spin and figure out, if you're considering either bike, which one you should go for. But before we get started, I'd like to say a big thank you to Lind Triumph for sponsoring today's video. They've got shops in Romford, Watford, Ashford and the central store you can see here. So if you're based in or around London and fancy taking one of these bonnies for a spin, don't hesitate to drop them a line. In my experience, their staff are super friendly and accommodating. There's a link in the description to their test ride booking form for each of these bikes. I'll get on the road in a moment, but first we'll go through the specs. This is the standard T100 that I'll be riding today in jet black. It uses the 900cc high torque variant of the liquid cooled Bonneville parallel twin, which is good for 54 horsepower at 5,900 RPM and 80 Newton meters of peak torque down at 3,230. It gets the same 270-degree firing interval that gives all of the Bonnevilles an awesome sound, as well as a slip assist clutch for a nice light feel at the lever. But along with the other 900s in the range, it gets a 5-speed gearbox as opposed to the 6-speed of the 1200s. In terms of the key dimensions, it has a 790mm seat height and a 213kg dry weight, so it's fairly substantial but not massive. The hardware used on the T100 suits its retro character and is nice and simple. It has spoked wheels with an 18-inch diameter front to help with that old school look, and they're shod with Pirelli Phantom tyres. As for braking, there's a single disc at the front with a 2-pot Nissin caliper and a single pot Nissin at the rear too. The forks and shock are from KYB and offer just preload adjustment on the shocks in order to compensate for a passenger and or luggage. Electronically, the T100 is pretty straightforward. ABS is always on, traction control can be switched on or off, and that's basically it. There's a speedo and a rev counter with some digital displays inside, but otherwise it's an uncomplicated motorcycling experience. The T120 that I've got here to compare it to is actually an Ace Cafe edition, which has a bunch of extras including a special paint job, 4-bar tank badges, engine badges, blacked out components, a bench seat, LED indicators and a bit of a tail tidy. But otherwise, all T120s get the following changes over the T100. The engine capacity is of course increased by 300 cc's to 1200, which results in substantially more power with a peak of 79 horsepower at 6,550 RPM. Torque is also up with 105 Newton meters produced at 3,100. Unsurprisingly, with a bigger engine comes a reduced fuel economy, with Triumph claiming 74 miles per gallon for the T100 versus 63 for the T120. The tank is the same capacity at 14.5 litres too, so you'll get a bit less range from the bigger bike. The T120's dry weight increases by 11 kilograms to 224, in part owing to the twin disc brakes at the front. It uses the same 2-pot Nissin caliper as the T100, but as you can see, there are 2 of them. There are some enhancements to the electronics in the form of 2 riding modes of road and rain, giving the rider a little more throttle control in challenging conditions, which might be handy with that extra torque. There's an LED daytime running light for improved visibility, and heated grips come as standard. On top of this, you get a center stand, and on the T120s, other than this Ace Cafe special, you get a passenger grab rail too. So those are the specs, but how do they compare on the road? So despite the fact that this is the smaller of the 2 bikes, or the smaller engine anyway, it's an absolutely perfect amount of power and torque for just riding around town like this. Many of you will know that I own a Street Twin myself, so pretty much the same bike as this, only slightly more modern styling, and that's exactly why I bought the Street Twin, was because the majority of the riding that I do is in London, so you're rarely getting up above 30 or 40 at the most, and what you need is a bike with a bit of torque down low that pulls well away from the lights and has a nice gutsy feel to it. But I guess where the T100 has an advantage over the T120 is that being a 900 instead of a 1200, it's that little bit more fuel efficient, and that difference in cost adds up obviously if you're commuting every day. It doesn't necessarily feel like a smaller bike though. It has the same dimensions as the T120, the same chassis, so it feels pretty much the same. The reach to the bars, the width of the bars, the 790mm seat height, it's all perfect for commuting around town. 790 for me, I'm about 5'9", you know, 790mm is not a big stretch to the floor. I can easily flat foot it, both sides, but it doesn't feel cramped either. If you are a little shorter or, you know, on the petite side, then you might appreciate the fact as well that it's that tiny bit lighter versus the T120. See, this is the good thing about demoing bikes from Triumph London. You might not get alpine switchback roads, but you do get to ride past Buckingham Palace and many other wonderful attractions. And it's also nice that the T100 gets the twin clocks. It still has that slightly more premium feel to the finish than perhaps, you know, the Street Twin or Street Scrambler, which get a single speedo with a digital readout. Here you get revs and speed, as well as two little LCD inserts as well. Now, I'm not going to be riding any motorways today, but I know firsthand from owning the Street Twin for a couple of years that that's where this bike will come up short. If you're riding solo and you're always in town, then you'll barely notice the difference between the two bikes, probably. But as soon as you get on the motorway, the fact that this only has 5 gears and that little bit less power, you know, those factors contribute to it feeling somewhat out of puff when you get up to 70. If you often have a passenger or you want to put luggage on it, you can get some soft luggage options for these Bonnevilles. You might be up for a bit of weekend touring or going further afield. You know, for the extra money, it's probably worth having that additional grunt that you get on the T120. You could do it on this bike. I've ridden my 900, my Street Twin, to Wales and back, but you'll find that in 5th gear at cruising speeds it's revving just a smidge more than you'd hope. And in situations where you're on the motorway and you want to overtake, some extra pep wouldn't go amiss. And the last area where you might mark the T100 down versus the T120 is possibly the brakes. So it's a single disc with a 2-pot caliper at the front. You get twin discs on the T120. You know, at these sorts of speeds you don't exactly need MotoGP brakes. So again, if the majority of your riding is in urban settings, chances are they're probably adequate. But like I've already said, if you two up, you're going a bit quicker, you've got some extra weight on the bike, those twin discs might provide some extra reassurance. But in summary, you know, this is a cracking little bike with that extra fuel efficiency, plenty of power for town, with a more old school finish and a little bit of extra chrome to it than something like the Street Twin. So that's the T100, but does the T120 really feel that different? Now, you probably wouldn't notice it if you demoed a T100, went away and thought about it, and then came back and rode a T120. But after riding them back to back, the T120 does feel ever so slightly more substantial. They are the same chassis, as I've already said, but this is about 10 kilograms heavier, and you notice that when you're pushing the bike, maneuvering it around outside the shop. This Ace Cafe Special Edition has a bench seat as well. I think that might add a little bit of seat height. And then the 1200cc Bonneville Twin does seem to have some extra bass and boom to it. So like I say, back to back, you'll notice that slight difference. A less subtle difference is that extra power. It's super noticeable. I don't want to understate just how different the power is between these two bikes, because although 900 to 1200 doesn't seem like a massive jump in capacity, that's really like riding two different bikes. Around and about town, can you really use it though in this traffic? I mean, I'm not so sure, but I've had the 1200 Scrambler from Triumph on loan as a press bike, and I did plenty of motorway work on it, and I can confirm that it's significantly more comfortable cruising at 70 plus than a 900 Bonneville. As for the brakes, there's noticeably more power, obviously having two of these 2-pot Nissans up front. You can feel that there's more power there. The initial bite is still pretty soft. It's not like sports bike braking, but I think that fits the character of the bike. It's got a retro feel, a bit of an old school feel. I don't think you'd expect to find razor sharp brakes on a bike like this. If you've watched any of my Street Twin owners reviews, I've said a few times that I'd prefer better brakes on that, probably twin discs. And personally, yeah, I do prefer the feel of this bike when you're on the brakes. Fortunately, I've been blessed with some good weather today, but it's worth mentioning that there's a mode button on the right hand switchgear, and that allows you to switch between road and rain. Obviously, if it's raining, you might prefer that duller throttle response just to avoid losing traction when you accelerate. You don't have to be quite as careful with the throttle. The other benefit of having a rain mode is that if you take a passenger often, it can smooth the ride out a bit for them as well, especially if you're in town where you're accelerating and decelerating and on and off the throttle quite a lot. Are there any negatives of the T120 versus the T100? Well, I guess if you've got your heart set on this more traditionally styled Bonneville, but you want the lightest possible bike, then there is that to consider. But really, I just think the rest of it comes down to cost. Do you want to part with that extra 1,700 quid for the bigger bike? So which one would I go for? Personally, I think the extra cash is probably worth it for the flexibility that the T120 offers, especially if you're thinking about going on motorways a bit further afield, weekend touring, that sort of thing. But if cost is the main factor for you, both in terms of purchase and running it, then the T100 might be a more sensible choice, especially if you're mainly riding in town and on B roads. But as always, I'd love to know what you think in the comments below. Would you go for the T100, or does an extra 25 horsepower sound too tempting? It'd also be great to hear from anyone who's bought either of these bikes with your experience of ownership. Drop me a line in the comments, and if you're new here and you want to see more videos like this, hit subscribe and I'll catch you next time.